Okay, good evening, everyone. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Catherine Gaither. She is presenting the topic this evening on negotiating death, indigenous mortuary responses to Spanish colonialism in Peru. The presentation examines the mortuary evidence from three Peruvian archaeological sites dating to the Spanish conquest and its immediate aftermath, exploring how indigenous communities navigated dramatic shifts in health and burial practices during this period of profound upheaval. At Puerchuco Huacarones, a comparison of prehistoric and post-contact burials reveal measurable declines in population health alongside significant transformations in mortuary behavior following European contact. At Magdalena de Cal Viejo, within the El Brujo complex, burials recovered beneath the floor of a colonial era Catholic church constructed as part of a reduction settlement demonstrate the creative agency of indigenous inhabitants who wove together traditional Indian burial customs into newly imposed Catholic frameworks. Finally, analysis of post-contact mass burials at Yosemite shed light on the more disruptive end of the spectrum, where conventional mortuary treatments appear to have broken down entirely, perhaps in response to an epidemic. Taken together, these three sites offer a multiscalar view of colonial period death in Peru, from individual adaptations and cultural negotiation to population level health crisis, and underscore the value of bioarchaeological and mortuary analysis for understanding lived experiences under colonialism. Dr. Gaither, our presenter tonight, is a archaeologist and forensic anthropologist whose fieldwork spans sites in Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and Colorado. Her research focuses on non-adult health and population shifts in health and mortuary practices before and during the colonial period, with particular attention to the ways that indigenous communities in the Andes navigated biological and cultural change in the wake of Spanish conquest. She's published widely on these topics and currently teaches at Upper Iowa University. Dr. Gaither, thank you for joining us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Um, and I'm going to say you will love, love, love the paint mines. They are so cool. So Colorado is my home. I graduated with my undergraduate degree from Metro State with John Kent as my professor and mentor. And after getting my degrees, I also went to work there as a professor, and he became a colleague of mine. So we're longtime friends. Um, so I have a special place in my heart for Colorado. I was born and raised there. So I really am happy to be making this presentation. All right, well, just that caveat here. This presentation does include images of human remains. It's not done gratuitously. It's necessary for the content. All right, with that, let's get started. As they said, I'm going to be looking at three sites here, Puruchuco Huacarones, which dates to between 1470 and 1540 CE. Magdalena de Cal Viejo, which dates to 1578 CE, and it was occupied for some 2 centuries after that. And the population from that site actually survives to the present day. And then Yosemite, there's no firm date for that, but it was dated to the post-contact period based on faunal remains. Horse teeth were found in the burial context. Now, there's no sites from North America in this discussion or other parts of the world, but I think these analyses are really important for any archaeologist or bioarchaeologist who might be working with acculturated communities. All right, so let's take a look at Puruchuco Huacarones first. It's on the central coast of Peru, and it's very close to Lima. It's on the outskirts of Lima. And what we have at the site are 2 cemeteries that were excavated. Huacarones, which dates to the late Horizon. The late Horizon is the last time period before the Spanish arrived. And then 57A SO3, which contains post-contact burials. When we look at the late horizon burials, this is again dating to 1470 to about 1533, you see that they are bundle burials. So there's multiple layers of cotton and textiles, and you have grave goods. The entire body is located in the main large bundle. This little head feature on top, they call it a, well, Willie, who we worked with, the archaeologist we were working with, called it a falsa cabeza because it was a fake head. And he didn't say cabeza falsa, he said falsa cabeza. So but the head of the individual isn't really in that. It's all the entire burial. The body would be in a flexed position, and it was all in the bigger bundle. The grave goods would be wrapped in the layers of the textiles and cotton, and it was often included with other bundles and grave goods outside of the main bundle. When we look at the 57 ASO3 burials, we see they look quite different, although there is an effort to kind of maintain the traditional mortuary treatment. So you can see that the body is in basically a flexed position, as was true before contact. And there's an attempt at bundling with some wrapping of textiles, but clearly the flex position of the body is not as tightly done. The bundle is not nearly as nicely done. There aren't multiple layers of textiles as there were before. And these tended to be solo burials with only a few, if any, grave goods contained in them. So there's a clear degradation that occurs of the funerary treatment, the mortuary treatment. But there's also enough there that tells us they were attempting to maintain the burial treatment, the traditional burial treatment. So aside from the shift in the mortuary patterns and the treatment of the bodies that we're seeing at the two sites, there are also some significant differences in the patterns of trauma seen for both adults and non-adults. So there's an increased frequency of trauma in general, and then there's an increased frequency of what we call perimortem trauma, and I'll explain that momentarily. And then there are changes in the type of trauma. We see many more extreme lethal injuries than were present in the pre-contact materials. When we look at the sample composition for each site, you can see we had large samples. At Huacarones, we had 321. At 57A SO3, we had 198 individuals. And this is for the adults, everybody over 15 years of age. Well, we still considered 15 to 18 within the non-adult context, but this was showing, including in the adults, everybody over 15 years of age. When we look at the perimortem trauma summaries, what we see is some dramatic increases. So for all of the trauma, cranial and postcranial, at Huacarones, there were only 24 cases, whereas in the 57 ASO3 materials, there were 167 cases. So dramatic increases. And then when we look at the type of trauma, cranial went from basically around 9.4% up to 17.5%. And postcranial trauma went from 4.4% up to 15%. So dramatic increases. And again, this is perimortem trauma, which basically means around the time of death. For the non-adult samples, you can see, again, we had some pretty good sample sizes, 169 from Huacarones and 73 from 57A SO3. And you can see the breakdown by age for each of the sites as well. So we had good sample representation across most age ranges. We see the same thing with the non-adult trauma statistics. For all trauma, we go from 6% in Huacarones way up to 21%. I'll try to do the Harry Enton, just way up, right? And For cranial trauma, we go from less than 1% up to 11%. And for postcranial, from 5 to 10%. So there are statistically significant increases in the trauma that we're seeing on these individuals. All right. Now, let me give you a quick lesson in what we mean by perimortem versus antemortem versus postmortem trauma. So antemortem trauma means before death. That means to determine that it's antemortem trauma, you have to be able to see some evidence of healing. It can be microscopic. It doesn't have to be visible to the naked eye, but you have to see some evidence of healing. It usually takes, depending on the age of the individual and whatnot, a week or two for healing to be evident in the bones. And so what you tend to see with antemortem trauma are the edges of the trauma are more rounded and smoothed. You might see a little bump on the bone. This is cranial trauma here is very nicely healed. Okay, so you see smoothed edges of bone. You see a little bumpy area. It didn't fill in completely, but it's still very well healed. In this femur that you see, this came from a child between the age of birth and 6 months old. Here's a normal femur. So you see there's a big lump of bone here on this femur. And that's what is you would think of as a scab on the bone. It's not completely healed. It's got a grainy look, a granular look. So that's it means it was in the process of healing when the child died. And here again, you see the normal femur, and on the other side of this femur, you can actually see the fracture line. And this was a spiral fracture, which I'll talk about momentarily, but it demonstrates a little bit of torsional force. So this would all be antemortem trauma. And as I said, even if you saw trauma that was microscopic, or evidence of healing, excuse me, that was microscopic, that would still characterize it as antemortem trauma. All right, postmortem trauma, you have sharp edges to the breakage in the bones. You have discolored edges with the edges of the break being lighter in color than the rest of the bone. And of course, no evidence of healing whatsoever. So you see around here, this little white areas, those are chipping that came off in the postmortem interval. And down here too, you see white edges on that breakage, which tells you it was postmortem. It's also got a very dry look to the breakage. And then perimortem trauma. Perimortem trauma occurs when there is moisture in the bone. So you get things like delamination. You can see here where there's sort of a peeling, you got a peeled off edge of bone. And you sometimes get little adherent fragments that just stick on, like there, and there's one. You can see this one up here. You also will get radiating fractures. The trauma here occurred in the back of the head, but you can see this fracture radiated all the way across the front part of the skull. And you'll get spiral fractures. You can kind of think of looking at perimortem versus postmortem trauma as the difference between breaking a dried twig versus trying to break a living twig off of a tree. So the dried twig just snaps straight across. It's dried. It usually creates a straight breakage line versus the living twig that you have to twist, and you get little parts that stick on, and you get little spiral fractures and radiating fractures on the twig. Okay, so when we look at the site in the 57 ASO3 materials, we see lots of adult perimortem trauma. This is an adult female, and you can see these very large fragment of bones were broken off on what would be the left side of her head. And the edges of the fragments were all either the same color as the rest of the bone or darker in color, which is consistent with perimortem trauma. And you see some evidence too of radiating fractures across here. We also have in these materials evidence of gunshot wounds. And these gunshots would have been musket ball gunshots. So they would create kind of a large hole. You can see there in that one, and you get a little picture of the bullet coming in from sort of an angle. and popping off a little piece of bone there. It's called a keyhole defect. In this one, you have something coming in from here and exiting out there. And again, you see the delamination that occurs, the radiating fractures, and of course, a lot of damage to the facial bones there. With the non-adult perimortem trauma, we see the same thing. We see, again, this individual was hit in the back of the head. This was a child between the ages of about 10 and 12 years of age. So a young child. They were hit in the back of the head. It produced these large fragments on the occipital bone. And all of the fragments are, the edges are either the same color or darker in color than the rest of the bone. You have the radiating fractures, you have the delamination and the adherent fragments. And then we also have, this was an older non-adult. This individual was between 15 and 18 years of age. And this is, again, evidence of a possible gunshot wound that would have come in from this direction, entered at an angle, and popped off a fragment of bone there. And then also blunt force trauma to the left side of the individual's skull, which may mean the person was right-handed. And it also indicates some face-to-face combat. Again, we have the specific weaponry with the gunshot wounds. Here we actually found the plug of bone that was created by the musket ball. And so you can see really well here the delamination, the peeling appearance, and the peeled part of the plug. And then you can also see these injuries, these quadrangular injuries, and you can see that there's a radiating fracture here. And you can see on the inside of the bone, it pushed in the inside of the bone in a way that indicates there was definitely moisture in the bone. Well, you think these injuries were likely made by a weapon called a pike, which is an axe that is often used on ships, and it's got a pointy end on it, but the pointy end isn't round. If you do a cross section of it, it's quadrangular. And I'll just say really quickly, for this individual, I think the weapon that did this was a mace. And that's, the ball with the metal spikes coming out of it, and then it attaches to some kind of a stick. And they often would be on horseback when they were coming after someone with a weapon like that. And the amount of force it would take to create this kind of breakage suggests to me that the individual was on horseback who was wielding that weapon. And additionally, with many of these gunshot wound defects, they're coming in from an angle, but they're also coming in from above. These are not like execution style gunshot wounds. They're coming in from above. So they also may have been made from horseback. All right, so in summary, the frequency of all types of trauma is statistically significantly higher in the early post-contact sample than the late horizon sample. There's a notable shift in the nature of the trauma, with even more lethal perimortem traumatic injuries evident in the early post-contact sample. And these injuries differ markedly from accidental injuries or patterns of what we would call today physical child abuse. Now, one of the questions was, hey, maybe they were spare the rod, spoil the child kind of people. Maybe they were, having their kids engage in dangerous activities at early ages. But when we look at the Walker-Rones samples, we do not see these kinds of injury at these frequencies in those samples. So in fact, I don't believe that they were having their kids engage in dangerous injuries. And the levels of what we would consider evidence of physical child abuse remain pretty stable and very low in both the pre and post-contact cemeteries. So that all suggests the differences seen are the result of Spanish contact and cultural conflict that ensued, with younger individuals being drawn into combat situations. So when we look at Magdalena de Calviejo, we're going to see a little bit of a different response. This is in the Chicama River Valley at the El Brujo complex. And the El Brujo complex consists of actually 3 huacas. Huacas were platform pyramid mounds. Huaca Prieta is the oldest. Waka cortada has this big old cut in it that the Spanish used to do this to the Wakas looking for gold. They'd go cutting in there to look for treasures. And then Waka Cayo Viejo, which is going to be the Waka that we're talking about today. At Waka Cayo Viejo, out in this area here, we see the remains of a Spanish colonial church and a Spanish colonial town. And here you can see from a Google Earth perspective, here's the Waka, here's the church complex, and here's the remnants of the town. And this was a very common pattern, not just from the Spanish, it's actually seen throughout the world. When people came in conquering people, they would plop their churches and towns down on top of indigenous sacred sites. And it's a way of sort of emphasizing the defeat of the indigenous gods, as well as sort of forcing indigenous peoples who would still want to continue worshiping at their sacred sites. Well, you got to come to our church if you're going to do that. So it was kind of a way of sort of symbolically and not just symbolically, literally conquering those sacred sites. All right. The site of Magdalena Cayo Viejo is a reducción. And a reducción was a forced resettlement of indigenous people into a Spanish town. So these were organized on a grid the way the Spanish towns would be organized. They had the Catholic Church there, and then they would gather native peoples from all around, and that included outside the Chicama River Valley as well. And these folks were then forced to live like the Spanish lived. They were forced to go to church and live in the kinds of housing that the Spanish had. And it was a common theme, as I mentioned, for conquest throughout the world. You know, conquer their gods and force them to adopt yours. And part of that is putting your sites down on top of theirs. So this was a reducción. Doesn't mean there wouldn't have been any Spaniards there. That probably the priest would have been Spanish. And interestingly enough, we did find the cranium of an African individual present at this site, which is interesting because the Spanish had laws at that time that prohibited African slaves from interacting with indigenous Peruvians. All right, the sample sizes and sex were possible. We did have 15 adults and 13 non-adults. Among those for which we could tell sex, we had 5 males and 4 females. So we had a fairly representative sample. And all of these burials come from underneath the floor of the nave inside the church. So here's where the area of the burials was. Here's where you would enter into the nave area. The altar would be up here. And then you can see the other parts of the church. And then outside of the church is a cemetery here. So the way the Catholic religion does things, some of you may know, or at least the way they used to do things, was that if you're baptized Catholic, and that included even the African slave, if you're baptized Catholic, you had the right to be buried on sacred ground. And sacred ground means it was blessed by a priest. But just because you were buried in sacred ground in the cemetery or even inside the church, that didn't guarantee that Satan couldn't still get you. So the ideal was to be buried inside the church as close to the altar as possible. So the individuals buried inside the church are likely higher status individuals than those in the cemetery. And individuals that would have been buried closer to the altar would have probably been higher status individuals than people buried further away, which is important for some of the interpretations, or maybe important for some of the interpretations. Okay, so we were able to identify that these burials were associated with the church as opposed to being earlier burials from the other time periods represented at the site, but because we were able to actually find a cut through the floor of the church going down into the burial chambers. And here you can see that even better. There's that cut, And this is an area of burials beneath the floor of the church. And part of the reason we had to establish that is because these sites, like many sites in Peru, are heavily looted. So we had to try to find a way to distinguish these individuals from what would have been burials from earlier time periods. And this did it very nicely for us. All right, so what we see in these burials is an actual mixture of Christian traditions with the pre-Hispanic, pre-contact traditions. So the burials were supine, meaning they were on their back, and they were extended. Most of the other burials at the Waka, dating to earlier time periods, were flexed bundle burials. The arms were crossed over the chest or the abdomen. Now, one thing that was not common, because normally for the Catholics it would be tradition to bury them in a coffin, but these individuals instead were wrapped in textiles, so they weren't buried in coffins. So that's more of a traditional pre-contact burial mortuary treatment. Also, the bodies were positioned with the feet toward the waka on a north-south axis. Now, that was also not the typical Catholic burial position. The typical Catholic burial position would be east-west. Has to do with the resurrection of Jesus. And then, as I said, the bodies were wrapped in textiles as opposed to interred in coffins. So that's an earlier pattern. And then there is also evidence for ritualized reinterment of body parts, which is a common Andean burial pattern that is associated with ancestor worship. They would sometimes take a body part from somebody who died at an earlier time period to inter with an individual who was more recently deceased, maybe because then now this person will accompany that newly deceased individual through the afterlife. And it's one interpretation anyway. So how did we get to that? Well, here you see individual A, and the upper part of their body is still very nicely articulated. So while there was looting in this area, this was not disturbed. And then we have individual B, who is underneath, going up underneath individual A, and the area underneath the upper body where the head of individual should be is not disturbed. So we should find individual B's head there, but we didn't. The head was missing. The skeleton was pretty nicely articulated, so it's not, that suggests the possibility of ritual reinterment where somebody had taken the head of individual B to include with another burial. All right, when we do a health analysis, we do see indicators of biological stress. What we have here are non-specific indicators of biological stress. So cranial lesions, porous cranial lesions. Periostosis is a new layer of bone that is laid down on an existing bone. And then linear enamel hypoplasias are lines that are put in the teeth as the teeth are forming. So if you are subjected to nutritional stress, let's say when you're a child, when your teeth are forming, you might have these lines in your teeth. Once your teeth have completely formed, then you don't have those things occurring. So there's evidence of biological stress, and we'll see some interesting patterns with that as well. So for example, in the adults with regard to porous cranial lesions, we didn't find statistically significant differences between the early sample of Huacacayo Viejo and the Magdalena de Cal Viejo samples. There wasn't, the differences did not rise to the level of statistical significance. But in the adults, what we saw was that what we would expect to see is fewer numbers of individuals with porous cranial lesions than what we had. We had 7 instead, and we should have had 3.5 if all things are equal. All right, and we saw the opposite pattern with the non-adults. We should have seen 5 individuals with porous cranial lesions, but we only had 2 in non-adult individuals with porous cranial lesions. Again, we didn't see statistically significant differences between the 2 time periods. And that's important for the interpretation, but these trends are really interesting too. We also did a study on the measure of the impact of juvenile mortality on fertility. And what we found was there was no impact. Magdalena de Calviejo was very similar to another post-contact site that is interpreted as a successfully adapted post-contact site. That's being the site of Iten. And it's also similar to some late pre-Hispanic sites. So there's not any big differences seen with juvenile mortality or fertility rates. So to summarize, we don't see a statistic. We do see evidence of biological stress, and that is very common, particularly in pre-modern era marine-based subsistence patterns, right? Because you have certain parasites that occur when you're relying on the ocean for food and whatnot, and the people here were relying on the ocean. So they did suffer biological stress, but because there was no statistically significant differences between the older materials and the post-contact materials, that suggests Spanish conquest and the aftermath was not the cause of those biological stressors. Cultural transformation is evident because we see that hybridization of mortuary practices that include both Catholic and indigenous funerary traditions. And then we also see there's no impact on of non-adult mortality on population fertility. That's very consistent with a population that has stabilized in this region. And here's where we get those interesting little patterns we were seeing with respect to the expected frequencies in the adults versus the non-adults. So the fact that we had a lower than expected frequency of biological stressors on the non-adult remains might indicate that for those children that had died, at this time period, the population had adapted pretty successfully, and so they weren't suffering, at least not any higher levels, and they were actually suffering lower levels than would be expected of these biological stressors. But for the adult remains, remember, they were kind of higher than expected if everything is equal. So that could indicate that when they were younger, when a lot of these lesions would have been forming, maybe they were still in populations that had not as successfully adapted to the colonial influence and the colonial processes that were in place. All right, this last site that I'm going to discuss, I'd like to dedicate to my friend and colleague Klaus Koschmieder. We were actually in the process of publishing these materials. They have not been published yet. So we were in the process of publishing them when he died unexpectedly in 2017. But he was an amazing archaeologist, a great colleague, and a really good friend. You can see he was quite adventuresome as well. This is, cliffside sites. We're talking about the northern highlands of Peru in the Chachapoyas region. So here you can see where Lima is, and then up here is Lamud, and here's Lamud here. And then the site of Yosumal is located between two rivers, the Hucusbamba and the Utcubamba rivers. It's a cliffside site, which is a common form for burying individuals in this region. They put them in. They would often bury people on cliff sides. And you can see you've got a retaining wall and a nice floor here. And from the drawing, you can see there's an artificial platform, some rocks, and then an area that has fill in it. And that's the area that contained the burials. And you can see after the floor has been removed, this is the area containing the burials. And you can see that here as well. Okay. Horses' teeth were found with the burials. And so that is what dates it to the post-contact time period. The samples, we had we had different age ranges, old and young. And we had the remains of at least 11 individuals, though realistically speaking, there's probably more than 12, probably somewhere at least between 12 and 15 individuals. So you can see sort of the distribution there of the burials. We had evidence of infectious disease. This is evidence of tuberculosis on the vertebrae. You can see it erodes away, it eats away at the vertebral bone. And there's some in the sacrum, in the sacral area there. So that's very typical of tuberculosis. We also had evidence of infectious disease in the form of syphilis. You can see this is a normal tibia, which is your lower leg bone, your shin bone. And this is this is diagnostic. This bowing of the tibia is diagnostic for syphilis. It's called saber shin. And on the crania of the same individual who had the saber shin, we found evidence of caricica, which is a cavitation that occurs on the cranium in individuals with syphilis. And then there was another individual who demonstrated evidence of syphilis as well. It kind of acts, the caricica, the cavitation, is kind of like a pimple, right? It pops up and then it collapses in on the bone. So, and we also have lots of evidence of ante-mortem trauma. This is sharp force trauma, likely from a sword. And this big area here is a trepanation. That's a surgery that is, we still do it today. If you have head trauma and your brain is swelling, they'll take out a piece of bone to allow the brain to expand, which very frequently will save your life. So these surgeons were very good at what they did. In fact, they had a higher success frequency than modern day neurosurgeons. So you have most trepanations that we have from the colonial and pre-Hispanic time periods on indigenous people were quite successful. Most of them were healed. This is completely healed. The wound and the trepanation is healed. This trepanation, very large and completely healed. This one was in the process of healing. You have some areas of trauma that were not healed, but this fracture continues on, and this part right in here is very well healed. And then you can see some grainy looking stuff indicating the trepanation was still healing. Most of the trepanations were associated with some form of trauma. And then we have facial trauma here. These individuals, this is the left side of the face, this is the eye orbit, and this is the nasal opening. And so they were hit in the face on their left-hand side. And this is another one. This one wasn't completely healed. It was in the process of healing. See that grainy appearance there. But this one up here was completely healed. We have no evidence of perimortem trauma. Okay, none whatsoever. So the sites date to the post-contact period as evidenced by the horse teeth. There are remains of at least 11 individuals and probably more, like 12 to 15. They were in a jumbled form, but they formed mostly complete skeletons. There were scattered grave goods found in a single grave feature. So they're all buried in one grave. The remains indicated that these individuals had been left exposed. There were insect remains, and there was also evidence of scavenger activity in the form of rodent gnawing. Now, it can be hard to protect a body from insects while you're preparing it for burial, but most of the time they would be able to protect from rodents getting at the body. So that suggests these bodies were exposed on the surface and not protected for at least a period of 2 weeks after these people died. Again, no perimortem trauma. That indicates they didn't die really as a result of a battle or a natural catastrophe. There was evidence of disease on the bodies, but syphilis and tuberculosis. But these are not the types of diseases that would have killed 12 to 15 people all at once. These types of diseases, though they will kill you, progress slowly. There was ante-mortem trauma that had completely healed. but there was no evidence of any disease that would have caused the deaths of all of these people at approximately the same time, which is important. All right, so we developed 6 hypotheses. The first 3, that these individuals were treated differently for reasons of status, but why did they all die at the same time? And why were they included in a single grave feature? Even if they were lower status individuals, usually even lower status individuals would get their own grave. Could these individuals have been killed as a result of a battle or natural catastrophe? There's no perimortem trauma on the bodies, and there surely would be if that was the case. Could they have died from starvation? Yeah, maybe, but they still wouldn't have necessarily died at all around the same time. And there's not any other evidence on the bones that suggests they were starving. Like you would expect that the body would start robbing the bone of nutrients. So you'd see severe osteoporosis, for example, and we don't see that. And then, of course, also, why would they necessarily be included in a single grave feature? Hypothesis number 4, could they have been sacrificed? Well, there certainly was sacrifice in this part of the world throughout history. But again, no perimortem trauma. Poisoning was suggested as a possibility, and it could have been. It wouldn't leave any evidence on the bones, but that would be an unusual method of sacrifice for the Andean region in this area. Also, the inclusion of some grave goods and the individualized wrapping of bodies kind of undermines this hypothesis, though they might have been some of them might have been sacrifices included with a principal burial, but we really couldn't identify a principal burial. And so that kind of doesn't work very well. There's problems with that idea. And then could they have been ritual reinterments? Some of these individuals, could they have been ritual reinterment of body parts where they had taken them from other burials and interred them in this grave feature? But this hypothesis is kind of undermined by the fact that the majority of the bodies were complete, or at least complete enough to suggest they weren't parts taken from another grave. Also, there's absolutely no stratigraphic evidence for the reopening of this grave feature. And we weren't able to identify a principle of burial that the reinterred parts would have been included with. So what we think is the best hypothesis is this one, that these individuals died from a disease that spread quickly through killing individuals quickly and perhaps killing everybody who lived in this area. The bodies were left exposed, they partially decomposed, and were later included in a single grave feature. So it would explain why they would be included in a single grave feature. It would explain why they were left exposed prior to the burial. Either people who were still alive felt they were at risk of being exposed to the disease, and so they abandoned the dead and the dying, and they came back later and buried them. Or everybody living in this area was dead, and then somebody came along later on and buried them. This hypothesis would explain also the lack of perimortem trauma and the haphazard placement of the bodies in the grave without much to demarcate one individual from another. The only thing that kind of undermines this a little bit is we only had one individual in the prime of life. Typically, when an epidemic sweeps through, as we have had unfortunate recent experience with, you get more individuals in the prime of life, but that doesn't mean that the old and the young are not still vulnerable to the disease. So it doesn't really undermine it. So we feel that the most reasonable or most parsimonious explanation for the distribution of the human remains is from an epidemic that swept through. Epidemics were common in the post-contact period. Of course, we had smallpox, but also flus. There were a number of flus that came through and killed a bunch of people. There was also some evidence of hemorrhagic disease that came through in the post-contact period that was brought with the Spanish. Because they kill individuals quickly and move through the population rapidly, it's easier to see. It's easy to see how these individuals might have died. Everybody died, or they were abandoned out of fear. And then at a later time, they came back and tried to do their best by the dead. They tried to incorporate some of the traditional mortuary practices to bury them. When we look at our overall conclusions from the 3 sites, we see that there really is no one size that fits all, right? At Peru Chucohuacarones, we see rebellion in the post-contact period that led to the degradation of traditional mortuary practices and the inclusion of younger individuals in combat and changes in the trauma patterns. At Magdalena de Calviejo, we saw successful adaptation strategies of indigenous populations into forced Spanish resettlement communities. We saw stratification with respect to along religious lines, with some people being buried under the floor of the church and others out in the cemetery. But the population survived. And in fact, there are descendants living in the modern town of Magdalena de Cal today. At Yosemite, we see the decimation of a local population likely due to an epidemic that came through and either killed everybody or caused some people to abandon either the dead or the dying and come back then and bury them at a later time. So there's variety in the archaeological expressions of an acculturation event, and that's something to keep in mind as you explore sites that were exposed to acculturation in other parts of the world. Again, no one size fits all. So I want to thank you for your attention to this matter. Sorry, I couldn't resist.